If you asked me a few weeks ago, I would say that the lake was just a quiet place, a refuge from the hustle and bustle of life. Spent my days there, alone, with the fresh wind beating on my face and the sound of water reassuring my mind. I am a fisherman, and for me, there is nothing more relaxing than waiting for a fish that never shows up. But this peace was about to turn into a nightmare I could never imagine. I grew up hearing stories about that lake, legends of people who disappeared, lost souls who inhabit its waters. The elders talked about what was below, as if the lake itself were an entity, waiting for their next victims. I always heard these stories with skepticism, laughing with friends when they mentioned what I considered only superstitions of a small town. "It's just a lake," I said. "Nothing to fear. Only fish and tranquility." But the truth is that there was something different in that place. Even when I laughed at the legends, I felt a presence, a tension in the air that I could not explain. Sometimes, when I throw the line, I feel a shiver in my spine as if being observed. But these sensations were just that, sensations. I have always let logic speak louder than fear. That morning I decided to go again. The sun was rising timidly, and I took my fishing rod, knowing barely that I was about to plunge into a darkness I could not imagine. The lake was calm, like a glass surface reflecting the blue sky. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of the line being thrown and the water splashing as the bait touched the surface. I sat on the edge of my boat, lost in thought, while waiting for some fish to bite the bait. The smell of water mixed with fresh air calmed me. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. Something that would change everything. As time passed, the line remained still. I was about to give up when suddenly I felt a pull. A strong pull, stronger than any fish I had ever hooked. My heart shot, the adrenaline started running in my veins. What could it be? Was it a giant fish? A feeling of excitement and fear enveloped me at the same time. I started to pull hard, my mind seething with expectation. I pulled with all my strength, the emotion pulsing in every fiber of my being. Whatever was stuck in the line moved with a wild energy. I felt a mixture of fear and excitement. It was as if I were about to discover a secret hidden in the depths of the lake. Finally, with a final effort, I managed to bring the thing to the surface. In place of a fish, however, there was a large, heavy black bag, swinging in the water as if it had life of its own. My heart sank. The first feeling was confusion, followed by a chill in the spine. What was that? With hesitation, I pulled the bag into the boat, almost waiting for it to shatter in my hands. Her weight was greater than I expected, and a feeling of disgust settled in my stomach. The surface of the bag was soaked, and the edges seemed to be stuck together as if something from inside was trying to escape. Curiosity overtook me, and a voice within me whispered that I needed to open. An inexplicable impulse forced me to act. I knew I should throw that thing back into the lake, but the idea of finding out what was there left me paralyzed. Then, with trembling hands, I began to untie the rope that closed it. What I saw paralyzed me. Inside the bag, parts of decaying human bodies were piled up, disfigured and wrapped in an unbearable smell that made me back away. My stomach turned, and a choked cry escaped from my lips. It was not just rotting flesh, it was fragments of lost lives, people who would probably never be seen again. The moment reality settled, I realized how serious the situation was. The lake, with its legends and dark stories, was not just a place for fishing. It was a cemetery, a repository of forgotten souls. The image of body parts haunted me, causing the mind to become a whirlwind of dread and disgust. I can't stay here, I thought. I needed to get out. Quickly, I threw the bag back into the water, watching as it disappeared on the surface, but the horror did not disappear with it. What I had done was irreversible. As soon as the bag hit the water, something strange happened. The boat began to rock violently, as if a storm had formed out of nothing. My heart popped, and I tried to balance myself, struggling to keep control. The sound of the water stirred filled the air, and a feeling of panic began to settle. It was as if the lake was claiming something that was taken from it. Then a dense mist began to emerge, enveloping everything around me. Visibility was reduced to almost nothing, and the familiar shapes of the lake became indistinct shadows. The silence that was once comforting now became oppressive, filled only by the sound of water and the echo of my own terrified thoughts. I was surrounded by the unknown. Something was wrong, very wrong, and a cold feeling settled in my mind. I was not alone. As the mist enveloped the boat, my heart beat wildly as if trying to warn of imminent danger. The lake, which had always been a refuge, now became a prison. The dense mist curtain seemed alive, undulating as if breathing, and I felt that it was not only the weather that had changed. There was something more, something supernatural and threatening. My senses were at the surface of the skin. The smell of rot still hovered in the air, and the memories of what I had seen in the bag haunted my thoughts. I looked around, but the visibility was practically zero. Everything I knew was now in an indistinct blur. The sound of water hitting the boat was the only indication that I was still floating, but the feeling that something was approaching left me alert. "Come back! Come back!" I cried, but the only answer was the echo of my own voice, distorted by the mist. I was beginning to feel that the lake was becoming aware of me, that somehow he knew my mistake. The legends about lost souls and revenge were more than just stories. They were warnings. And then I heard a subtle sound in the midst of the noise of water and fog whispers. Indistinct words that seemed to float in the air around me, but I could not understand. My mind began to run, wondering if I was really listening to that or if it was just a product of my imagination, worn out and anxious. But as the whispers grew, I realized that they were not just echoes in my head. They became clearer and panic took hold of me. "Help, help me." A desperate voice seemed to come from all sides. I looked around, looking for the fountain, but there was no one. The loneliness of the lake became oppressive, and I wondered if those voices were people who had disappeared there, trapped in an eternity of suffering. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," I cried, my voice echoing in the mist, but the answer was a low laugh, almost like a whisper of mockery. The boat swung more strongly, and I felt a presence, an invisible force pulling me down, as if the lake was trying to absorb me. The mist became thicker, and with it the air temperature dropped dramatically. The cold penetrated my bones, making me shudder. Every fiber of my being told me to act, to return to the coast, but something held me there, as if the waters of the lake had become a magnet for my will. And then, before I could process what was happening, a figure began to emerge from the fog. It was a tall shadow, wrapped in a dark cloak, with a presence that made me feel a paralyzing fear. The panic took hold of me and I tried to back off, but the boat swung so much that I could not stand. "You disrespected the lake," the figure said, his voice echoing like a distant echo. "You found what you shouldn't have. Now the choice is yours." I didn't know how to answer, the words slipping from my lips. What did she want from me? What had I done to deserve it? Terror was pressing on my chest, and the choice between fighting or succumbing seemed more complicated every second. And deep down, a voice within me whispered that there was something else at stake, something I couldn't understand. And so, as the mist closed around me, I realized that my fate was intertwining with the lake and its dark secrets. The hooded figure floated in the mist, a living shadow against the gloomy backdrop of the lake. The presence was oppressive, as if the air itself were charged with electricity. My body was paralyzed, caught between the need to run away and insatiable curiosity. What was that entity? And what did she want from me? "You dared to dig up the secrets of the lake," the voice echoed deep and grave. "What you found is not a mere accident. It's a warning. A reminder of what happens to those who do not respect what is hidden here." I didn't want to. I didn't know. I tried to protest, but the words seemed insignificant in front of that force. Fear numbed my mind and the truth began to draw. The legends were not just stories. They were warnings to keep people away from a place that held unspeakable horrors. The figure approached slowly, and I could feel the weight of her gaze, even with the hood covering his face. "I can give you a choice," said the entity, his words creeping like mist. "You can have your life back, but in return, you must offer me what was taken from me." The words echoed in my mind, and I struggled to understand. What did it mean? "What do you mean by offer?" I asked, the voice faltering amid panic. "The life of another," the figure replied, as if he were speaking the simplest truth in the world. "A life in exchange for his own. You will become part of me and your story will be forgotten. But first you must choose." My heart has popped. The thought of sacrificing someone made me sick, but at the same time, the prospect of being consumed by the darkness of the lake made me terrified. How could I decide? How could I live with the weight of this choice? "You're trying to fool me," I replied, anger taking over. "I won't do that." But deep down, the doubt began to spring up. I knew that if I did not accept the covenant, what would happen to me? The entity came even closer, and I felt a pressure as if the mist itself was wrapping me. "Despair is a treacherous friend," she whispered. "The lake is full of souls waiting for deliverance. You're just one step away from being one of them." The idea of becoming a part of that darkness began to spin in my mind. What had I done to deserve it? Why had the lake chosen me? And if I had not what to offer, what would happen to me? I struggled with the feeling that my life depended on that choice. Each breath became harder. I needed time to think, to understand what was at stake. But as I pondered, a certainty began to form. The fog, the presence, the offer, it all seemed a trap intended to capture me. I won't do that, I cried, trying to find the strength inside me. I will not sacrifice another life to save mine. A deep silence followed, and the boat swung once more. The figure stopped, and I could feel her fury in every fiber of air around me. The lake seemed to shake, and the whispers increased as if the space itself was crying for lost souls. Then you have chosen your destiny, the voice echoed, almost a lament. The lake will not forget its refusal. You will be part of us, forever. And with these words, the terror I feared came true. The waters began to shake violently, and I felt as if I was being pulled down, as if the lake itself were claiming what belonged to it. Looking at the hooded figure, I knew I had crossed a line. The thick fog seemed to envelop me, and the sound of the waters became deafening, as if the lake itself were screaming. I could no longer distinguish reality. Everything had become a nightmare. The boat swung violently, and I felt as if I was at the mercy of the force of the lake, being pulled into the depths. The feeling of drowning was approaching, and I struggled against the invisible current, trying to keep afloat. The voices, now clearer, cried out for help and promised revenge. No, I can't do that, I cried to the figure, desperate. I won't join you. But the answer was an oppressive silence, which enveloped me like a shroud. The waters began to shake more intensely, and I saw skeletal hands emerging from the surface, holding my boat with a supernatural force. They were the lost souls that I had ignored, claiming what was yours, waiting for a new member in your realm of pain. I didn't want to become one of them. My survival instinct activated, and in a last effort, I started to rock the boat, trying to escape. What I had found, the bag, the human parts, were not just traces of past lives. They were echoes of choices made, of covenants made. I knew I had to do something drastic. With all my strength, I jumped out of the boat, diving into cold and murky waters. The feeling of the cold liquid enveloped me like a hug, but the fear of sinking pushed me. I swam toward the shore, desperate to escape that curse. But the hands, now many, pulled me down, dragging me towards the darkness. You can't escape, the voices echoed in my mind. I struggled, trying to get over myself, but the strength of lost souls was overwhelming. As the waters closed over me, I remembered the stories I heard about the lake, the lives that were taken and the pacts that were made. And then, in the midst of despair, an idea arose. If I could not escape, perhaps I could face the entity in another way. Concentrated my energy, and in a primal cry, I invoked the power I still had. Let me go. I'm not part of your game. The words came out like a roar, and for a moment everything was silent. My hands hesitated, and I felt a weakness in the chains that held me. At that moment, my will and the strength of the lake collided. It was a battle of souls, and I was determined to win. With a final effort, I managed to free myself, swimming with all the forces that remained. The surface began to approach, and the light of the very white coast shone in the distance. When I finally emerged, the fresh air filled my lungs, and the sight of the beach gave me a new life. But I wasn't sure that it was completely free. I looked back and saw the hooded figure, now a distant shadow, watching as the waters receded. The lake, once familiar, was now a threatening entity, and I knew that the battle had not yet ended. Still, I had chosen life. With a last look at the lake, carrying the stories it held, I turned and ran to safety from the shore. The weight of what had happened still hovered over me, but the determination to never return to that place drove me. The lake would remain a mystery, a reminder of the choices made and the horrors it held. And though I escaped, the voices and echoes of what I had found would not abandon me so easily. The legends were real, and I was now part of them, a living story that somehow would continue to unfold. Always enjoyed fishing at dawn. The tranquility of the night, the silence, just me and nature. So I decided to camp on the lake tonight. Took my things and went alone. It wasn't the first time I'd been to this place, but somehow this time looked different. Upon arrival, the young man describes the scenery of the lake, the quiet darkness and the tall trees that surround the area. He sets up camp near the lake, organizing his belongings with the care of those who are already accustomed to this type of activity. The night is cold, the sky covered with scattered clouds, no moon, but he feels good. I started by setting up the tent near the shore, a few meters from the water. I wanted to hear the sound of the lake as always. The surrounding forest was quiet, maybe even too quiet. I usually hear the animals moving, but this time there was nothing. It bothered me a little, but I soon left it. I was there to relax. As I adjusted the last stake of the tent, I heard the first noise. A crack, something dry, as if a branch had been broken in half. I raised my head and stood still for a few seconds, trying to identify where it came from. It was not unusual to hear animals walking through the forest, but this time, it didn't sound like an animal. It was heavier, more calculated. He stops for a moment, holding his breath. His eyes run along the line of trees that surround the camp, but everything is dark, almost impenetrable. The lantern illuminates only a small area, and besides that, there are only shadows that seem to move subtly with the wind. I decided to ignore. It should be just a deer or maybe a raccoon, I convinced myself. I kept putting up the tent, trying to concentrate on what I was doing. But as I passed my hands through the ropes, I felt a strange sensation in my back, as if being watched. I turned again, just to confirm that there was nothing there. The young man tries to calm down, but as time goes by, he realizes that the sounds are not so easy to ignore. The forest, which once seemed a peaceful refuge, now seems strangely alive. He hears more claps, coming from different directions, almost as if something was circling the camp, watching closely but not revealing itself. The silence was beginning to bother me. In fact, it was not complete silence. It was the kind of silence interrupted by distant pops and whispers. Part of me wanted to investigate, but another part said it was better to leave it alone. Better concentrate on what I came here to do. That's when I heard something else. A sound of being dragged, as if something was being pulled from the ground. He turns quickly, the lantern trembling in his hand. Points the beam of light in the direction from where the sound came, but again, there is nothing but trees and darkness. The beam illuminates the fog that begins to form between the trees, increasing the feeling that it is being surrounded. The dense fog distorts the forms, making it difficult to distinguish what is real and what is the fruit of your mind, already tense. I picked up the lantern and pointed it in the direction of the sound, trying to see if there was anything there, but all I saw were the shadows of the trees, long and deformed by the light. I took a deep breath and told myself that I was exaggerating. There was nothing there. The wind was shaking the leaves and the sounds of the forest were normal, right? Right? But the discomfort only increases. The sound that once seemed distant is now closer, as if whatever was in the forest was slowly approaching, testing its limits. His instincts say something is wrong, but he tries to continue what he was doing, tying the last ropes of the tent with trembling hands. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't want to admit it to myself. He kept hearing that sound, and now it seemed to come from all directions. I stood still for a moment, listening intently. The wind was blowing through the trees, but the sound wasn't from the wind. It was something more. It was like someone was moving, but I didn't know exactly where. The darkness around him seems to come alive, and he begins to imagine figures among the trees, figures that hide in the shadows. Your mind, already on the edge, begins to create disturbing images. He looks around several times, the lantern flickering in his hands, but every time the light illuminates a new area, he only sees the emptiness. Still, the sound of something approaching persists. The lantern was shaking in my hands. I pointed it back and forth but could not see anything. Every time I moved the beam of light, I expected to see something, someone, but there was nothing there. Only the forest, dense and dark. But the sounds did not stop. And then, it was silent again. A frightening silence, as if even the wind had decided to stop. At this moment, the stillness is even more terrifying than the noises. He stops, trying to hear anything that might indicate what is going on. The silence seems to extend for an eternity, making the young person feel even more isolated and vulnerable. He begins to think about getting his things and leaving, but his stubbornness and desire to fish make him hesitate. The silence was absolute. Nothing moved. Neither the wind nor the branches, nothing. Only the sound of my own breath and the rustle of leaves left on the ground. I stood there with the lantern in my hand, not knowing whether to continue or just leave. But deep down, something told me it was too late. Something or someone was already watching me. I tried to ignore the sounds. I tried to convince myself that it was all just my imagination, that I was tired. But the more time passed, the harder it became to hold on to this idea. The claps came from all sides, closer and closer, and there was something in the air, something I could not describe. It was as if the forest itself were breathing around me. The tension increases as the young person realizes that the situation is getting out of control. The light of the fire he lit seems insufficient to ward off the mounting darkness. He feels that the forest is closing in on him. The sound of the claps continues, now more intense, and he can no longer ignore them. The feeling that something is circling the camp gets stronger, but he still can't see what it is. The fire now seems so small, so fragile. The flames danced and flashed, but the light was not enough to make me feel safe. Every shadow she cast seemed to move, as if something was lurking in the darkness, watching. I wanted to believe that I was alone there, but I couldn't anymore. The sound of branches breaking, of leaves being trampled, came from all sides, and my mind was on the verge of collapse. He tries to concentrate on fishing to distract himself, but the sounds of the forest do not let. Every movement he makes seems to echo the silent night, and each time he looks around, the darkness seems thicker. He begins to feel chills and realizes that he is sweating cold, even with the low night temperature. I took the fishing rod, thinking that focusing on it would help me forget about the sounds around. But every time I tried to focus, something distracted me. It was as if the noises were getting louder, more present. And now I was sure that I wasn't imagining things. The fear began to infiltrate, cold and annoying, in my spine. The steps around become clearer. They are not fast, they are slow and deliberate, as if something or someone is approaching slowly, testing him, hoping he makes a mistake. He lights the flashlight and points to where he thinks the sound is coming from, but again he sees only shadows. I lit the lantern and pointed in the direction of where the steps came. My heart was racing and my whole body was tense. But what did I see? Nothing. Nothing but dense shadows and trees still. Still, the sound was there, and this time I was sure that I wasn't just listening. I was feeling. Something was surrounding me. I didn't know what it was, but I knew it wasn't good. The flashlight starts flashing, threatening to go out, and he feels panic. His breath is panicked, and he forces himself to remain calm. But the feeling of being watched is overwhelming. He feels eyes on him, following every movement he makes. The silence is now broken only by heavy breaths, and he is not sure if all these breaths are his. The lantern started to flash, and for a second my heart stopped. The last thing I needed was to be in total darkness. I turned the beam of light around, trying to find some sign, anything that explained those sounds. Nothing. But the feeling that I was being watched was unbearable. It was as if I could feel the eyes upon me, as if the forest itself were alive and waiting for the right moment to act. He finally gets up, nervous. His instincts are screaming for him to get out of there, but his rational mind is still trying to find an explanation. Maybe it's a big animal, a deer, or even another fisherman he hasn't seen. However, the idea of finding someone in that place makes him even more nervous. He never saw anyone fishing there at dawn, and if it was another fisherman, would have already appeared. My mind was divided. One part of me screamed for me to get my things and get out as fast as possible, but the other tried to rationalize. Maybe it was just an animal. Maybe I was exaggerating. Or who knows, another fisherman. But something inside me knew that it wasn't the case. No one in their right mind would be there at that time, in that place. I was the only one stupid enough to think it was a good idea. Suddenly the sounds stop. Silence returns, even more frightening than before. He hears only the sound of water moving slightly against the shore of the lake. But it is a deep silence, as if even nature itself had stopped breathing. He feels a cold in the air, something abnormal for that time of year. And then it all stopped. The clapping, the footsteps, the sounds of leaves moving, everything was gone in a second. The silence that followed was different. It was heavy, oppressive. It was the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl, that leaves you with the feeling that something is wrong. The wind had stopped, and the only sound left was that of the small waves crashing on the shore of the lake. The absolute silence makes you even more tense. Something is about to happen. He tries to convince himself that it is just the forest being forest, but the atmosphere around him is charged with an energy that he cannot explain. His eyes look for any sign of movement, but there is nothing. He is completely alone, and at the same time, feels that he is surrounded by something invisible. The quietness did not bring relief, on the contrary. It was the kind of silence that precedes a storm, when you know something is about to happen but have no idea what. The tension was palpable, and I didn't know if I was ready for anything. I was alone, but at the same time I felt like I wasn't. I could not see anything, but there was a presence. I could feel it. I was standing there, completely motionless, trying to hear anything, but the silence was deep, almost suffocating. My mind was running, looking for a rational explanation, but I could not find. The cold that was only uncomfortable before now became unbearable, as if the air around me had become heavier and colder from one hour to another. My fingers were shaking, but I didn't know if it was because of the cold or the fear. He feels that the time around slows down, as if the world itself is stuck in an endless instant of tension. The flashlight, which had blinked before, completely extinguishes, plunging him into total darkness. His heart is racing, and the only thing he can hear is the sound of his own panting breath. And then the flashlight went out. I was completely blind. The panic began to spread through my body, and for a moment, all I could hear was the sound of my own heart beating wildly in my chest. I tried to push the button of the flashlight, shake it, anything to make it work again, but it was useless. I was alone in total darkness. Without the lantern, he is at the mercy of whatever is out there. He tries to convince himself that he should keep calm, but the shadows of the forest seem to move around him, as if something is lurking, approaching without being seen. He is completely vulnerable, not knowing where the danger will come from. The darkness around seemed to come alive. Even without light, I could swear that the shadows were moving. I tried to breathe slowly, keep calm, but my whole body was shrinking in fear. Every little sound seemed amplified. The sound of leaves on the ground, the rustling of branches in the wind. But now I knew it wasn't just the wind. There was something else. Then he hears again the sound he most feared, steps. But this time they are very close. Slow, heavy, deliberate. They approach him, coming from the direction of the forest. He stalls, his body frozen in a mixture of terror and disbelief. The steps are different from before, more determined, as if whatever was in the forest had finally decided to reveal itself. It was when I heard again. Steps. They were not like the sounds of before, distant and vague. These were close, heavy. Someone, or something was walking towards me. Each step was measured as if he knew exactly where he was going. My whole body stopped. I couldn't move and my heart seemed to be about to explode. I wanted to run, scream, do anything, but was completely paralyzed. He feels a presence around him, something much closer than before. Something that he cannot see but knows is there. The feeling of being observed completely envelopes him, and he begins to sweat cold, even in the chilly morning air. The young man tries to scream, but his voice fails as if his own fear was suffocating him. I could feel it. You didn't have to see it. Whatever was there, now it was close, very close. Every cell in my body was on alert, and I knew deep down that I had nowhere to run. I tried to open my mouth to scream, but nothing came out. My throat was dry, as if the air itself had disappeared. I was stuck at that moment, not knowing what to do. Suddenly he feels something touch his shoulder. It's not a breeze, nor the soft touch of a leaf. It is something cold, almost icy, and the contact is firm as if someone was holding it. The shock is immediate, and he jumps forward, instinctively trying to escape whatever has touched him. That's when I felt. Something touched my shoulder, and the cold of that touch was unbearable. It wasn't a breeze, it wasn't a leaf. It was firm, solid, as if a hand had reached me in the darkness. The shock made my body react before I could even think. I jumped forward, trying to escape from it, but I tripped and almost fell. The fear was absolute now. I knew I was being hunted. He stumbles and falls to his knees, breathing uncontrollably. The noise of the steps stops, and the forest again becomes silent. But he knows that it is still there, lurking, waiting for the next move. Desperate, he tries to get up, but his legs are weak, as if the fear has drained all his strength. I fell to my knees and silence came back as oppressive as before. But I knew that was still there. It hadn't gone away. He was waiting for me like a predator who plays with the prey before attacking it. My mind was spinning, the dread drained me every second that passed. I tried to get up, but my legs seemed made of rubber, with no strength to support me. At that moment he decides to run for the car. All he wants is to get out of there, but something stops him. It's not physical, it's psychological. A voice in his head, whispering, saying that it's no use, that he will never escape. He struggles with this feeling, trying to find the strength to run, but his body does not seem to obey. I had to get out of there. My only thought was the car. Run, drive, run away as fast as possible from that place. But something held me. Not physically, but psychologically. A voice, low, whispering, echoed in my head, saying that it did not help, that there was no escape. It was as if my own body had given up, surrendered to the terror that surrounded me. Finally, he can stand up. He shakes from head to toe, but forces his legs to move. He starts running towards the car, his heart beating so fast that he can barely breathe. Every step seems to echo in the forest, and he has a feeling that something is following him, something he can't see but is getting closer. With all my strength left, I stood up and began to run. My vision was blurred, my thoughts confused. I knew I couldn't stand there, I knew it was chasing me even though I couldn't see. Every step I took seemed to echo in the forest, and the feeling of something following me closer and closer grew with each second. I ran as fast as I could, feeling the invisible weight of the forest on my back. The car was just ahead, but with each step, the distance seemed greater, as if the ground itself were stretching to prevent me from reaching my only escape route. The young man reaches the car, his heart pounding in his chest as if to explode. His trembling hands can barely grab the keys from his pocket. He looks back into the darkness of the forest, and is sure that something is lurking, something he cannot see but is about to reach him. Panic consumes him completely, but he finally manages to unlock the car and jump inside. When I finally reached the car, my hands were shaking so much that I almost let the keys fall. I looked back into the impenetrable darkness of the forest and felt that presence approaching. It was as if the surrounding air were charged with electricity, pulsating with something that did not belong there. My panic grew, but I managed to open the door and threw myself into the car. He turns the key on the ignition repeatedly, but the engine does not start. Each attempt makes the despair increase, the heart shooting even faster. Outside, the forest seems to observe him, and he feels that same presence approaching, like an invisible shadow growing every second. The silence of the engine failing is deafening, broken only by the distant sounds of branches cracking. I tried to start the car 1, 2, 3 times, but nothing. The engine coughed, but it didn't start. The feeling that something was watching me grew every second, and the silence outside seemed deafening. Each sound of the branches cracking sounded like a warning, and my mind could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was the fruit of fear. Just knew I had to get out of there. The young man hits the steering wheel with his hands, frustrated and terrified. He tries to start the car once more, and this time the engine finally starts. He feels a temporary relief, but at the same time, knows that it is not safe. As he speeds away from there, something makes him look in the rearview mirror. And that's when he sees. I hit my hands on the wheel, desperate, and tried again. Finally the engine started, and the relief I felt was almost immediate. But I knew I was not safe. As I accelerated, a part of me, perhaps by pure reflex, made me look in the rearview mirror. And that's when I saw it. In the reflection, something moves in the shadows of the forest. He cannot identify what it is, but its shape is irregular, distorted, almost like a spot in the darkness. She seems to writhe, change shape as he watches him move away. The young man feels a cold shiver running through his spine. For a second, the figure seems to look directly at him, as if he knows that he is seeing. Something was moving in the shadows of the forest. It wasn't an animal, nor a person. Its shape was irregular, like a spot of living darkness that writhes. I couldn't tell what it was, but I knew he was watching me. And for a brief second that thing seemed to stare back at me. A cold shiver ran through my body. It was as if he knew I was seeing. The young man looks away from the mirror, taking a deep breath and trying to keep control. He presses the accelerator harder, wanting to get away as soon as possible. But the feeling of being followed does not disappear. Even without looking again, he knows that it is still there, watching, perhaps even accompanying him. The way back seems longer than it should be, and he cannot get rid of the impression that time itself is against him. I looked away from the mirror, taking a deep breath, trying to control the fear that was pressing on my chest. I accelerated as fast as I could, but the feeling of being followed continued. Even without looking back, I knew that it was still there, watching me, maybe even following me. The path seemed to stretch, as if time itself was conspiring against me. Finally, he arrives at the main road, where he feels a little safer. The lights of the poles light up the way ahead, but he does not dare to look back again. However, the feeling of being observed persists, like a shadow stuck to your skin. He drives in silence, not knowing if what he saw was real or just a reflection of his own fear. When I reached the main road, relief was immediate. The lights of the poles lit up the way, and for the first time I felt that maybe I was safe. But I did not dare to look back again. Still, the feeling of being watched continued, clinging to me like a shadow that I could not shake. I drove in silence, not knowing if what I saw was real or just a manifestation of my own fear. When he gets home, he locks himself in the room, trying to convince himself that everything was just fruit of his imagination. But at night he has a disturbing dream. In the dream he is back to the forest, but this time he is trapped, unable to move. He feels the same presence, now much closer. When he looks at the sky, he sees that the darkness of the forest completely surrounds him, as if the night itself was swallowing him. When I got home, I locked myself in the room. I tried to convince myself that it was all just my imagination. But that night I had a dream. In the dream I was back in the forest, trapped, unable to move. The presence that I had felt before was closer than ever. I looked up at the sky, but the darkness of the forest enveloped me completely, as if the very night were swallowing me. He wakes up sweating cold, with the sound of branches still cracking echoing in his head. But when he opens his eyes, he notices something strange. The bedroom window is open and a cold breeze enters, making the branches of the tree outside move. He stands up to close the window, but hesitates, feeling again that invisible presence, as if something was there watching him from outside. The end is open, with no clear answers, leaving the young and the reader with a sense of unsolved mystery. I woke up with the sound of branches still echoing in my head. It was cold sweating, but I noticed something strange. The bedroom window was open. A cold breeze was coming in, and the branches of the tree outside were moving softly. I stood up to close the window, but then hesitated. The feeling of being watched returned, intense, as if something was waiting for me out there in the shadows. It was a sunny and cloudless day when my friend Daniel and I decided to go fishing on a deserted beach that we have heard about for a long time. The idea of escaping from the routine and enjoying the tranquility of the sea seemed perfect. Daniel was always the most adventurous of us, while I used to be more cautious, but the idea of spending a day away from everything was too tempting. We arrived at the beach in the morning, and the sun was shining brightly, reflecting on a calm blue sea. The waves broke gently in the sand, and the only thing we could hear was the sound of wind and birds. The place was deserted, no sign of other fishermen or tourists, and this added a layer of excitement and freedom to our journey. We set up our boat, a small kayak, and started to refuel it with the necessary equipment, fishing rods, baits, and some beer cans to relax. During the tidying up, Daniel commented on a legend he had heard about that place. They told him that on certain days the sea might behave in strange ways, and some fishermen were never seen again. I laughed at the story, trying to ward off any sense of restlessness, but I could not help a slight shiver that ran through my spine. "Oh, it's just a story to scare the rookies," said Daniel as he struggled to fit the baits into his rod. Those words should have calmed me, but something in the back of my mind began to bother me. After we set up the boat and organized the equipment, we decided it was time to leave. The sun was at its peak and the surrounding heat encouraged us. Daniel, always excited, was already standing in the boat, rowing hard, while I, a little more hesitant, still checked if everything was properly safe. "Come on, you have nothing to fear," Daniel shouted, his contagious enthusiasm mixing with the cool sea breeze. He always had this way of pushing me out of my comfort zone, and despite my nervousness I could not help but smile. Was about to embark on an adventure, even if there was a slight feeling that something could go wrong. As the boat moved away from the shore, the beach became a thin line of sand and vegetation, and the vastness of the ocean surrounded us. The waves were soft, and the experience was, until then, exactly what I expected. We talked about everything and nothing, remembering stories of past fishing, and each laugh, the tension I felt seemed to dissipate. "Imagine if we caught a giant fish today," said Daniel, his eyes shining. "It would be the best fishing of our lives." He was so focused on the future that I didn't have the courage to mention the legend I had heard, for fear of breaking the magic of the moment. So, I decided to put the stories aside and just enjoy his company. After a few minutes of paddling, we reached a point where the water seemed deeper and calmer. The sky, before clear, began to change slowly, with dark clouds appearing in the distance, but I did not worry. "A little cloud won't stop us," said Daniel as he began to prepare his fishing rod, throwing the line into the water with confidence. "Look, a perfect place," he exclaimed as I followed his example, launching my own line. The waves gently swung the boat, and for a moment everything seemed to be in perfect harmony. Deep down, a strange feeling that we were alone in the vast ocean began to form, but I ignored it, immersed in the expectation that something special was about to happen. As the sun began to hide behind the clouds, Daniel started telling some stories about his fishing experiences in strange places. However, his words about legends and mysteries of the sea began to echo in my mind, a seed of restlessness that could not shake. "Sometimes the sea can be a treacherous place," he said with a nervous grin, but I just laughed, believing we were about to have a memorable day. With the lines thrown and the conversations diminishing, the boat swung gently on the waves, and the rhythm of the water seemed to hypnotize. The sound of the sea became almost musical, but there was something else I could not identify, a feeling of growing expectation in the air. As we sailed further, the sky darkened even more, and the wind began to blow with a little more force. Heavy clouds piled up, covering the sun and casting shadows over the surface of the water. Daniel, always optimistic, looked up and commented, "I think it's just a drizzle, nothing more." But for me, the change in atmosphere was palpable. The beauty of the scenery now carried a weight, and I could not get away from the idea that something was wrong. "Let's go further?" Daniel suggested, his almost contagious excitement. The boat moved with agility, cutting off the water while I hesitated. "It's not too far from the shore?" I asked, but he just smiled and insisted. "It'll be fun, I promise." I ended up agreeing, pushed by his energy and the idea that we were about to live a great time of fishing. After a few minutes, we finally reached a point where the waters were deeper, and the feeling of isolation was accentuated. The sound of waves breaking in the distance seemed distant, almost like an echo as we concentrated on fishing. The beach was now just a blob on the horizon, and the feeling of being alone in the sea grew more every moment. As we tried to fish, the wind intensified, bringing a stronger salty smell and a cold that cut. "It's going to be a great catch, I feel it," Daniel said, though the excitement in his voice was beginning to wither. The water around us was calm, but the absence of any movement began to make me uneasy. I looked at Daniel, who was focused on his rod, but the look on his face had changed, now reflecting a slight concern. Suddenly, a low and distant sound came to us like a bang, but there was no storm in sight. The sky was still cloudy, but nothing indicated that a storm was forming. Looked at Daniel, who frowned and began to pull the line from his rod. "Did you hear that?" he asked, and before I could answer, the boat began to rock more intensely. "Must be stronger waves. Shall we go back?" I asked, but the idea of returning seemed a challenge he was not willing to accept. "Just a few more minutes," he insisted, his tone a little more nervous than before. The mysterious sound continued to intensify, as if something was approaching, and I began to feel that we were too far away, both physically and metaphorically. I looked at the horizon, where the coast seemed more distant than ever, and a restlessness began to grow within me. "Daniel, maybe we should really go back," I said, but before I could insist, the water around us began to shake in an inexplicable way. It was as if the sea was shaking, reacting to something we could not see. The tension in the air became palpable, and fear began to invade my mind. What was happening? The sea, which once seemed a refuge, was now a place of mystery and fear. I looked at Daniel, whose eyes were now wide, and he cast a look that said it all: we were in trouble. The waves began to shake violently, and the boat swayed like a toy in a storm. The tension that hovered in the air now was accompanied by a palpable fear, and adrenaline ran in my veins. Daniel tried to keep control of the boat, but the water seemed alive, reacting to a force we could not comprehend. "It's just a little excitement, let's relax," Daniel tried to convince himself, but his voice was loaded with nervousness. The breeze that was once refreshing now turned into a sharp wind that seemed to push us away from the shore. The salty smell of the sea became more intense, almost suffocating, and the dark clouds above began to slowly spin, as if the sky was closing in on us. Then we heard a sound that made us freeze, a deep and distant roar, like that of a colossal creature emerging from the depths of the sea. Fear took hold of me, and I looked at Daniel, who had stopped rowing. "Did you hear that?" He shook his head, eyes wide, as the sound continued to grow in intensity. Before we could react, something came out of the water. It was not a fish, nor an ordinary object. It was an indistinct shape, but it was large and was coming rapidly, as if it were coming directly toward us. The sea began to splash water into the air, and the surface shook in monstrous waves. "What is that?" I cried, but my voice could hardly be heard over the roaring of the sea. Whatever was emerging seemed to have a presence of its own, a supernatural force that defied logic. A dark shadow protruded into the water, and the boat swung even more, almost turning. The adrenaline made me take the fishing rod and hold it as if it were a weapon, although I knew that would not help anything. Then suddenly everything was silent. The roar stopped, and the water calmed down instantly, as if the world had held its breath. Daniel and I looked at each other, the confusion and fear stamped on our faces. What had just happened? What had we seen? In that tense silence, we decided it was time to go back. Daniel started to row hard, but before we could move forward, a shadow moved under the water. A deep panic took hold of me when I realized that the sea was beginning to get dark, as if a dense fog was forming around us. Visibility was reduced to a few meters, and I could feel my heart racing. "We're going back now?" I cried, but the atmosphere was charged with an energy that made the task almost impossible. The boat seemed to be stuck, and even though Daniel was rowing with all his strength, he could not move us. The feeling that something was holding us intensified, as if the sea itself were rejecting us. And then we heard a new sound, a whisper that seemed to come out of the depths, sliding among the waves. It was an indistinct voice, but there was a tone of urgency and despair. "Help me." The words echoed in our minds, and a cold cut ran through my body. "Daniel, did you hear that?" I asked, but he just looked at the horizon, his eyes full of terror. The fog enveloped the boat, and the presence that once lurked beneath the surface now seemed to be all around us. Whatever it was watching us, and we were no longer alone. The air became heavy, and the darkness seemed to deepen, plunging us into a nightmare from which we could not escape. The thick fog enveloped the boat, making everything around us indistinct and surreal. It was as if time had stopped. The whisper that was once almost imperceptible now became deafening, echoing in my mind. "Help me." The voice sounded like a lament, a cry for help that seemed to come from the depths of the sea. Daniel and I were frozen, our eyes sweeping through the dense fog. "We need to go now," I screamed, but the panic was griping my throat. The boat, which had been floating freely, seemed to refuse to move, stuck in a sea that now became a true abyss. Suddenly, a movement in the water caught our attention. A huge shadow began to rise, its shape writhing beneath the surface, as if something colossal was about to emerge. The noise of the water shaking filled the air with the sound of a roar, as if nature itself was protesting against our presence. "Row?" Daniel exclaimed, and we both began to row frantically, but the mist seemed to absorb our forces, hindering every movement. The shadow approached, its outline beginning to define itself, something that did not belong to this world. Fear took hold of me, and the feeling of impotence intensified. I looked at Daniel's face and saw the terror reflected in his eyes. Whatever was coming, it was something we couldn't face. And before we could understand what was happening, the fog suddenly dispersed, as if something had broken the spell that held us. The water again shone in the moonlight, revealing what had been hidden. An immense sea creature, with grotesque forms and tentacles that moved in a hypnotic way, appeared in all its terrifying glory. His eyes were bottomless black holes, and an oppressive pressure took hold of the environment. And in an instant, the creature quickly approached the boat. The movement was so fast that it seemed to defy logic. A colossal wave formed behind it, rising like a mountain, and we, powerless, could only watch as the water began to rise. "Hold on," I cried as the boat began to be swallowed by the wave. Panic took us and the adrenaline shot. We tried to hold on as much as we could, but the sea was in chaos. A desperate cry escaped from our lips as the water enveloped us, dragging us down. For a moment, everything was silent. The water closed around us and the pressure crushed us. But then, in an instant of lucidity, I realized that we were floating again, as if the creature had lost interest in us. When we emerged from the surface, everything was different. The boat was intact, but the fog had cleared, and the beach seemed farther away than before. The sky was clear, but the air was loaded with an unexplainable tension. "What was that?" Daniel asked in a trembling voice. What had happened? Our hearts were beating frantically, but the creature was no longer in sight. I looked out to sea, where the surface now seemed calm, but a feeling that something was watching us persisted. The idea that we were not alone became a certainty, and fear settled. We decided to go back, but even as we sailed back to shore, the feeling that something had changed was undeniable. Whatever we had found in the sea was not completely away. It was as if the creature was still there, in the depths, waiting for the next encounter. As the boat approached the sand, I looked back one last time, and a gentle wave glided over the surface, as if the sea was breathing. Daniel and I exchanged quiet looks, a mutual understanding that what we experienced was only a fraction of what really existed in the abyss. The mystery was not solved, and the sea seemed to hold secrets that would never be revealed. The last image that stayed in my mind was of the horizon, where the line between water and sky was. With the breath still heavy and the echoes of the voice echoing in my mind, we knew that we could not go back there again. The sea had its own stories, and we were just spectators of a tale unfolding in the shadows of the depths. With the boat finally touching the sand, reality began to settle down. The sound of waves breaking on the shore was reassuring, but could not dispel the terror that still pulsed in our veins. The moon, now high in the sky, illuminated the deserted beach with a soft light, but there was something different in the atmosphere. It was as if the sand and waves themselves shared a secret that we were not worthy to know. Daniel and I got off the boat, but the feeling that something was watching us persisted. The forest stood up behind us, its shadows stretching out like black fingers, and the distant whisper we heard in the sea still resonated in our ears. The desperate call that echoed in our minds had not disappeared. Instead, it seemed to reverberate with an even greater urgency. As we began to disassemble the boat, the silence was interrupted by a subtle sound, almost a whisper coming from the water. I looked at the sea and saw a strange ripple on the surface, as if something was moving under the waves. It was an almost hypnotic movement, a constant reminder that what we had faced had not been a delusion, but a terrifying experience that connected us to something greater and much older. "Do you think something will happen again?" Daniel asked, his voice trembling. I didn't know what to answer. The only certainty I had was that the sea had not finished telling us its story. A cold ran through my spine as a thought formed in my mind. What if what we experienced was not just a warning, but a call for something deeper, something that was still lurking? With a heavy heart, we decided to leave the beach. As we walked through the sand, the moonlight reflected in the sea, creating a spectacle of glimmers that moved and danced, as if the sea itself was trying to seduce us back. With every step, I wondered if there would be a day when we could understand what really happened there, and if one day we would have the courage to face the sea again. When we got to the car, a deep silence enveloped us. We both sat inside, distant and confused looks. Whatever we found in that sea, something had changed within us. The questions were many, but the answers remained hidden in the depths. The car's engine roared when it was started, but before leaving, I turned to look for the last time at the beach. The waves still broke gently, but a disturbing sensation hovered in the air, as if the sea was whispering promises of more mysteries. As we drove away, the sound of the waves became a distant echo, a reminder that not all the secrets of the ocean should be revealed. The story we lived that night would remain with us, a mystery among friends, a tale that could not be fully shared. As the road stretched before us, a question resounded in my mind. What if the creature was still there, waiting for another opportunity, ready to reveal its secrets to anyone who ventured back into its waters? And so, while the sea disappeared in the background, we knew that the legends of the ocean were more than stories. They were warnings that some mysteries are destined to remain in the shadows, in the depths, waiting for the next curious who dares to approach.